The arrow came from nowhere, and David Turner threw himself sideways off his horse, with the kind of instinct that only years of riding dangerous roads could build into a man's bones. It split the air exactly where his throat had been a half-second before, and it punched into the bark of a pine tree with a crack that rang out through the pre-dawn forest like a gunshot from a world that had never invented guns. He hit the muddy track shoulder first, rolled, and came up with his short sword drawn and his eyes already scanning the tree line. The caravan behind him was chaos, merchants screaming, horses rearing, the heavy wagon wheels grinding against each other as the drivers lost their heads. "Cover, get the wagons off the track," he bellowed, but he was already moving toward the source of the arrow because that was the job. That was always the job. You ran at the thing that wanted to kill you, or you died on your knees, and David Turner had never been good at kneeling. What he found at the edge of the tree line was not a bandit. She was standing over 3 bodies, 3 men in the crested livery of House Vaughan, their rust-end gold colors already darkening with mud and blood where she had put them down. She held a recurve bow of dark wood banded with iron at the grip, and she was already knocking a 4th arrow, her eyes moving across the trees with the calm, precise attention of a wolf counting a flock. She was tall, powerfully built, and dressed in close-fitted warrior's leathers dyed the color of deep forest shadow. A sleeveless vest laced tight across her chest with a broad belt cinching her waist, dark trousers tucked into knee-high boots studded at the calf with iron rings, bracers on her forearms that had seen hard use. Her skin was the deep olive green of old bronze, her jaw strong, her tusks small and carved with a single thin spiral on each, a clan marking David had never seen before. She was, without question, the most striking woman he had seen in all his years on the frontier roads, and she was also clearly the reason the arrow had nearly taken his head off. "Easy," he said, because his voice was steadier than his heartbeat. "I am not with them." She did not lower the bow. "The caravan you ride with," she said, and her voice was low and precise, accented in the rolling consonants of the eastern clans. "It flies Vaughan colors on its rearmost wagon." "It flies merchant colors," he said. "Gerald Vaughan is a cloth merchant. He has no politics." "Every man named Vaughan has politics right now," she said. "Either he is a fool who does not know what his cousin has done in the last 2 weeks, or he is a liar." "Which is he?" David considered. He had been hired 10 days ago in the border town of Ashford, 3 silver coins a day to ride point for a cloth merchant making the forest road run to the frontier market at Keld's Crossing. He had met Gerald Vaughan twice, a soft, nervous man who counted bolts of linen obsessively and sweated when it rained. A fool, probably, not a liar. "Fool," he said. She studied him for a long, unblinking moment, then slowly, deliberately, unstrung the arrow and settled the bow across her back. "Gerald Vaughan's cousin Aldrich seized the Keld's Crossing garrison 2 weeks ago," she said flatly. "He has declared himself provisional governor under emergency order and is collecting tolls on every road within 2 days' ride of the crossing. He is also rounding up orc traders and holding them for what he calls border violations. 3 of my clankin are in his stockade." She looked at the 3 bodies at her feet without the slightest change in expression. "His soldiers have been ranging along this road looking for something. I have been ranging with them, keeping track of what they want. When I saw your caravan, I thought you were his resupply." "What are they looking for?" David asked. "Me," she said simply. He stared at her. Then, because there was nothing else useful to say, he said, "My name is David Turner. I ride point for caravans. I am not now and have never been in the employment of anyone named Vaughan." Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but a slight easing at the corners of her eyes. "Azra Ironhide," she said. "I am a banner rider for the Ironhide clan, or I was, until Aldrich Vaughan decided the frontier laws did not apply to him." "Banner rider," he repeated. "That means you carry messages and treaty papers between the clan territories and the frontier towns." "It means I ride alone through dangerous country because I am faster than any escort and harder to kill than most soldiers," she said, and this time there was something that might have been dry humor in it. It also means I had 3 sealed treaty letters in my saddlebag when Vorn's men ambushed my camp 4 nights ago. They took my horse, my letters, and 3 of my people. I got away with my bow and my temper. David looked at the 3 dead soldiers, thought about the arrow that had nearly killed him by accident, and felt the shape of the situation settling around him like a cloak. "You need to get to Keld's Crossing," he said. "I need to get those letters back," she said. "They are not just messages. They are the only documentation of the water rights agreement that has kept the Ironhide clan and the frontier settlements from going to war for the last 6 years. Without them, Aldrich Vorn can claim the agreement never existed, and he will have his excuse to push the clans off the eastern borderlands entirely." She said it without self-pity, which made it worse. "He wants the timber. He has always wanted the timber." David looked back at the caravan, which had mostly stopped screaming and was now huddled behind the wagons in various states of uselessness. He thought about the 3 silver coins a day, about the fact that Gerald Vorn was going to want explanations about the 3 dead soldiers, about the very long road ahead and the hostile garrison that was apparently waiting at the end of it. He was not a political man. He had no clan loyalties, no family name worth anything, no land and no title. He was a man who knew how to ride and how to fight and how to read a road, and he was good enough at all 3 that he was rarely out of work. That was the whole of him, and he had made his peace with it. But the woman standing in front of him had lost her horse, her dispatches, and her people to a man who had decided the law was whatever he said it was, and that particular kind of wrong had always made something in David Turner go absolutely still and cold and certain. "I will get you to the crossing," he said. "We will figure out the rest when we are there." She looked at him with those direct, measured eyes, and he had the distinct sensation of being weighed and sorted with the same precision she used on the tree line. "You are a caravan guard," she said. "I am," he agreed. "You do not know me. No, you nearly died from my arrow 30 seconds ago." "I did," he said. "And you apologized very efficiently by killing 3 men who were apparently trying to find you, so I am prepared to call it even." She was quiet for a moment. The forest dripped around them, and somewhere behind David, Gerald Vorn was making a high, thin sound of distress that carried even through the trees. "All right, David Turner," she said. "Let us move before his patrol is missed." They moved. Persuading Gerald Vorn to carry an orc woman in his caravan took approximately 40 minutes and 3 separate conversations in which David explained, with increasing directness, that the alternative was to try to drive the forest road to Keld's Crossing without a point rider, with 3 dead garrison soldiers at their backs and a hostile provisional governor waiting at the other end. Gerald sweated through all of it, but he was a practical man underneath the nervousness, and he came to the same conclusion David had already reached. The situation was going to be dangerous regardless, and having Azra Ironhide on their side of it was considerably better than having her on the other side. She rode in the second wagon, or rather, she rode on it, settling herself at the front board with her bow across her knees with the casual authority of someone who had decided where she was going to sit and was not interested in further discussion of the topic. David rode point. They did not talk much through the long first day, because there was nothing to say that the road did not already say for them. The caravan was moving through country that was getting increasingly tense, and both of them were watching the trees with the same alert attention. She missed her horse. He could tell. Not from any dramatic show of grief, but from the small, quiet way she tracked every horse in the caravan with her eyes cataloging gaits, checking legs, noting which animals were sound and which were favoring a forefoot. She was a horsewoman to her bones, and she had lost her animal to men who did not deserve to hold the reins of anything. On the second evening, when Gerald set the caravan in a half-circle at the edge of a broad meadow, and the drivers began unharnessing, David walked his own horse to the picket line and found Azra already there, running her hands down the legs of the big roan warhorse that Gerald used for the caravan's lead animal. The horse had been favoring its left foreleg since midday, and she had clearly noticed. "Stone bruise," she said without looking up. "He needs it packed with clay tonight or he will be lame by morning." "I will let the driver know," David said. "I already have the clay," she said, and held up a small bundle of damp forest clay wrapped in broad leaves. She had collected it, he realized, without saying a word to anyone, just quietly solving the problem because that was what she did. She began to apply it to the horse's hoof with firm, practiced hands, and the roan, which normally bit strangers, stood completely still and let her do it. David watched her work, and he was aware that he had been watching her work all day with the same helpless attention that he usually reserved for difficult terrain. There was something about the way she moved economical and sure, nothing wasted, that made it very hard to look at anything else. "Where is the Ironhide clan's main camp from here?" he asked, because a question was better than standing in silence feeling things he had no business feeling about a woman he had known for 36 hours. "2 days east," she said, "past the Greywood and up the Aldmer Ridge. My war leader is there." She will already know something has gone wrong. When a banner rider does not return on schedule, the clan prepares for trouble. She smoothed the clay flat with her thumb. But without the treaty letters, she cannot act on that trouble without giving Vorn the legal justification he needs to call it aggression. "He has the letters now. He has the originals," she said. "I have the copies in my head, every word of them. But a testimony without documentation is just a story, and Vorn controls the magistrate at the crossing." She looked up at him then, and the evening light caught the planes of her face, the curve of her tusks, the dark intelligence in her eyes. "You understand what is at stake?" "I do," he said. "Most humans would not care," she said. It was not an accusation, just a flat statement of experience. "Most humans have not spent 7 years riding the frontier roads," he said. "Out here, the clans and the settlements survive together or they do not survive at all. Anyone who tells you different is either trying to steal something or has never spent a winter on the eastern side of the Greywood." She studied him for a long moment, and he had that sensation again of being weighed. 7 years, she said. "That is a long time to ride alone." "It is," he agreed. She returned her attention to the horse, and David found his gaze drifting to the lines of her back, the flex of her shoulders under the worn leather vest, and he made himself look at the trees instead, which was considerably less interesting but significantly safer. The third day on the road was when things went bad. They came around the long curve past Millhaven Ford and found the bridge gone, not washed out, gone deliberately. The timber pilings had been cut at the base, and the whole structure had been pushed sideways into the river, where it had broken apart and was now moving downstream in sections. On the far bank, David could see the marks where horses had stood waiting while the work was done. Vorn's garrison had cut the only reliable crossing between Ashford and Keld's Crossing, and they had done it recently. The wood ends were still pale and fresh where they had been axed. "He knows we are coming," Azra said, from somewhere very close to his left shoulder. "He knows someone is," David said. "He does not know it is us specifically." "He knows I am alive," she said. His men at the tree line were not trying to capture anyone. They were trying to confirm a kill. When they did not come back, he concluded the obvious. She looked at the river. It was running high and brown with spring melt, fast and heavy, wide enough that swimming across was a gamble and deep enough in the center that it might be a fatal one. How far to the next ford? David thought about the roads. Heron's Shallows, 12 miles north, but that road brings us into the crossing from the garrison side. Vorn will have men there. And south? South is the Greywood in full, he said. No road, heavy timber for about 8 miles, and then the Aldmer Ridge comes down to the river. There is a place called the Narrows where the ridge pinches the river down to maybe 40 feet across and the current slows. He paused. "I have never actually crossed it. But I know people who have." Azra looked at him steadily. 40 feet is crossable on horseback if the bottom is firm. "If," he said, Gerald Vaughan, who had been listening from the board of the first wagon with a face the color of old cheese, said, "We cannot take wagons through 8 miles of untracked forest." "No," David agreed. "We cannot." He looked at Azra. "But 2 riders can." She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them. A clear, mutual understanding that this was the decision point, that past this moment they were committed to each other and to the outcome of this regardless of how it resolved. "I will need a horse," she said. "Take mine," he said before he had fully thought it through. "He is steadier in rough ground than any of Gerald's stock. I will ride the roan." She blinked, and for just a moment something moved behind her eyes that he could not name, something surprised and careful and oddly soft. "You would give me your horse," she said. "You are the one who can shoot from horseback," he said. "You should have the better animal." He said it practically, and it was a practical truth, but they both knew it was also something else. A man did not give up his horse on a dangerous road unless he trusted someone more than he trusted his own survival. She took the reins from him without another word, but her hand closed over his briefly as she did. A single moment of deliberate contact, warm and firm, and then she was checking the girth with the same precise attention she gave everything. And David was walking to the roan with his pulse doing something it had no business doing. They left the caravan at the cutoff with David's promise to send word from Keld's Crossing and Gerald's stuttering assurances that he would go back to Ash Ford and wait. David took his saddle roll, his short sword, a quiver of arrows, and enough dried meat and flatbread to last 3 days. Azra took her bow, her bracers, and the absolute iron composure of a woman who had decided the situation was what it was, and she would meet it accordingly. The graywood was ancient and dense, the kind of forest that had never been logged or settled, where the canopy closed 60 feet overhead, and the light came down in long columns through the gaps like something from a temple. It smelled of wet bark and deep loam, and the particular cold that never entirely leaves ground that has not seen full sun in centuries. They rode in silence for the first hour, picking their way through the undergrowth on paths that were more suggestion than reality, and David found himself navigating by the sound of the river to their west and the memory of old conversations with trappers and hunters who had passed this way before him. "You know this forest," she said, at some point in the second hour. It was not a question. "I know people who did," he said. "I know the stories of it. There is a difference." "Not as much as you think," she said. "A person who listens well to the right stories knows almost as much as the person who told them." He glanced at her. She was watching the canopy above them with those quiet, attending eyes. "Is that how you learn territory?" he asked. "From stories." "From stories and from writing," she said. "In the Ironhide clan, the banner riders are trained to memorize country by listening to people who have been there, and then to compare what they find against what they were told. The difference between the story and the ground is where you find the truth." She paused. "And sometimes where you find the ambush." "That is a very good way to think about it," he said. "It has kept me alive," she said simply. He found himself wanting to ask her more about the clan, about the banner rider training, about the 6 years of the water rights agreement and what it had cost to negotiate it, and what it meant to the people who depended on it. He wanted to know who she was when she was not navigating a crisis, what she laughed at, whether she slept easily or lay awake listening to the dark the way he did. He had been alone on the roads long enough that the want of real conversation had become a kind of constant background ache. And here was someone who spoke with the precision and directness he had always found most valuable in a person, and he wanted to drink it in. But the forest required attention, and so he saved the questions for later and watched the trees. They reached the Narrows in the mid-afternoon, and it was both better and worse than David had expected. Better, because the river was indeed narrowed here by the ridge, compressed to a rushing channel no more than 45 feet across where the rock walls angled in on both sides. Worse, because the spring melt had charged it beyond anything the trappers' stories had accounted for. The water was white at the center, churning over the rocky bottom with a roar that made the horses shift and blow, and even at the edges it was dark and fast and hip-deep. Azra studied it for a long moment. "Firm gravel at the edge," she said, "deeper rock shelf at the center. If the horses commit and do not stop midway, we cross." "If they stop midway, the current takes us," David said. "Yes," she said, "so we make sure they do not stop." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was no calculation in either of their faces, just the same clear-eyed acceptance of what had to be done, and the steadiness that came from having survived enough dangerous things to know that fear was only useful before you committed, never during. "Together," he said. "Same moment. If one of us goes in, the other pulls." She drew a coil of rope from his saddle roll. He had not even mentioned it was there, but she had catalogued the gear when she took the horse, because of course she had, and tied one end to her saddle horn with a knot he recognized as a quick release. She tossed the other end to him, and he tied it the same way. The rope between them was maybe 15 feet, enough slack to move but not enough to lose each other. "Count of 3, she said. "Count of 3, he agreed. At 3, they both drove their heels in, and the horses went. What happened next was about 6 seconds of the most purely terrifying thing David had experienced in 7 years of frontier roads. The horses hit the shallow edge and kept moving because there was nothing else to do, and then the gravel dropped away, and they were in the deep channel, and the current hit like a wall. His roan lurched sideways and went chest-deep in a single plunge, and David felt the cold slam up through the saddle like a punch, and the world became noise and white water and the terrible sideways pull of the river against every part of him. He heard his horse grunt and surge, felt the rope between him and Azra go bar-tight as she was swept a half-step ahead of him, and then they were moving, not swimming, not fighting it, but angling downstream at the current's insistence while somehow still crossing, the horses' legs churning, their heads above the white water with the desperate determination of animals that had decided to live. The rope yanked hard twice, and both times he held it and felt her hold it from the other end, and the far bank was coming. It was coming. And then the roan's hooves found gravel again, and he lunged up the slope and out of the water with a heave that nearly unseated David. And a half-second later David's horse came scrambling up behind them, trailing silver sheets of water. They stood on the far bank and shook for a moment, all 4 of them 2 humans and 2 horses, and the river roared past below them with complete indifference to their survival. Azra looked over at him. She was soaked from the waist down, her dark hair plastered flat, and there was a cut on her forearm from where the rope had dragged, and she was breathing hard. She looked at him with those eyes, and he looked back at her, and then, without warning, she laughed. It came out of her sudden and genuine and warm, a real laugh of pure relief and something that sounded like joy, and it transformed her face entirely. "Count of 3, she said. "Count of 3, he agreed, and he was grinning, which was frankly embarrassing for a man who was supposed to be professional about these things, but he could not help it. They made camp 2 miles from the Narrows, in a hollow between 2 old pines where the ground was dry and the canopy above was thick enough to turn rain. David got a small fire going, smokeless pine, nothing that would carry on the wind, and they spread their soaked gear to dry. Azra took inventory of her bow with the careful attention of someone checking whether a friend was injured, running her hands along the stave, testing the string, checking every wrap joint. The bow was fine. She let out a breath and set it against her saddle. "Tell me about Aldrich Vorn," David said. "Not the politics, him." She thought about it. "Ambitious," she said. He served under 2 different garrison commanders and was passed over for promotion both times, which he blames on incompetence in his superiors and not on his own character. He is clever enough to seize an opportunity, but not wise enough to know which opportunities are worth seizing. He has the political support of 3 merchant houses in the crossing who want the eastern timber contracts, and those men have been feeding him the idea that the clan agreements are the only obstacle between them and the forest. She looked at the fire. He is the kind of man who convinces himself that what he wants is also what is just. Those are the most dangerous kind. And the garrison, David asked. "How many?" 40 men as of the last count my scouts gave me, she said. "But half of those are local levy frontier men who joined for the wage and who have no particular love for Aldrich Vaughan's political ambitions. If the situation is clearly presented to them, some will not fight." She looked at him across the fire. "We need to get into the garrison's records hall. The treaty letters will be there. Vaughan will have kept them as trophies, as evidence. He is the kind of man who keeps records of his victories. And the 3 clankin he is holding," David said. "Yes," she said quietly. "Them too." He watched her face in the firelight, the controlled stillness that covered whatever she felt about having people she was responsible for sitting in a stockade because of her. "How long have you been banner rider?" he asked. 5 years, she said. "Since I was 22. She looked at him directly. "How long have you been a road guard?" 7 years, he said. "Since I was 23. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something close. "We are the same age and have been doing very similar jobs for almost the same time," she said. "And we nearly killed each other at the start of it." "Almost," he said. "The arrow missed." "I do not miss," she said, and met his eyes, and the implication was very clear. She had judged the arrow's placement to the inch and had chosen for it to miss him before she had known anything about him, because something in the first half-second of seeing him had told her he was not an enemy. He did not know what to do with that, so he looked at the fire. "David," she said, and the sound of his first name in her mouth in that precise rolling accent was something he felt in his chest. "Why are you helping me? Truly. You could have turned south with the caravan. You could have taken the road to Harren's Shallows and stayed clear of all of this." He thought about it carefully, because she deserved a real answer. "I have been on these roads long enough to know that when someone like Aldrich Vaughan decides the rules do not apply to him, the first people to suffer are always the ones with the least protection," he said. "And I have watched enough of that go unchallenged to know that it gets worse every time someone turns south instead of making a stand." He paused. "And there is the fact that you are trying to protect something real, an agreement that keeps people from killing each other. That seems worth some risk." She was quiet for a long moment, watching him with that weighing attention, but warmer now than it had been at the beginning. "You are a strange man," she said finally. "I have been told," he said. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "Strange in the way that things of genuine value are strange. Rare." He met her eyes, and the fire popped between them, and the night was very quiet around them. And David Turner was aware, acutely, bone-deep aware, that something had shifted between them in the course of the conversation that could not be shifted back. They rode into the outskirts of Keld's Crossing the following evening, coming in from the eastern forest track that skirted the garrison's main approach road. Keld's Crossing was a frontier market town built at the junction of 3 trade roads, dense and noisy and smelling of sawdust and tallow, and the constant particular smell of a place where too many animals and too many people lived too close together. It had a permanent population of maybe 800 and swelled to twice that on market days, and it was exactly the kind of place where 2 filthy travelers coming in from the forest on tired horses attracted almost no attention whatsoever. Almost. Because Azra Ironhide was not a woman who disappeared into a crowd. She was too tall, too green-skinned, too obviously armed, and she carried herself with the absolute unself-conscious presence of someone who had never in her life tried to make herself smaller for other people's comfort. Several people on the main street stopped to stare. A few moved aside. 2 merchants in front of a cloth stall went very still and very quiet in the way that told David they were recognizing her, or at least recognizing what she was, and making calculations. He moved his horse up beside hers so that they were riding abreast, close enough that the visual message was unambiguous. She was with him, and he was present, and anyone who was thinking about making something of it was invited to think harder. She did not look at him when he did it, but the corner of her mouth moved. They found a back street in called the Woodsman's Rest. the kind of place that asked no questions about guests as long as the coin was good, and they got a room on the second floor with a window that looked over the stable yard. David paid for the room because Azra had lost everything she carried when Vorn's men took her camp, and he said so plainly, and she accepted it without argument and without embarrassment, which told him a great deal about her. They ate in the room, cold pie from the inn's kitchen and rough bread and water, because a fire would have been visible from outside, and they were not ready to announce their presence, and they planned. Vorn's garrison was in the old customs house at the north end of town, a two-story stone building with a fenced yard where the stockade was. The records hall would be on the ground floor of the main building. The 3 captive clankin were presumably in the stockade yard. The gate guards changed at midnight. "There is a tanner's yard that backs onto the garrison fence," David said, drawing the layout from memory. He had been to Keld's Crossing 3 times before, and he had made a habit of knowing the geography of every town he passed through regularly, because that was the kind of thing that kept you alive. "The fence is 6 feet. I can get over it." "I can get over it faster," she said. "I know," he said. "I need you on the outside covering the gate. If the alarm goes up before I get the 3 of them out, I need you to create a distraction large enough that we have a window to move." Considered him. "You are going in alone." "I am smaller and quieter," he said, "and if I am caught I am a lost caravan guard who wandered in by mistake, which is a story that can be believed. If you are caught, there is no story in the world that helps you." She did not argue, which told him she had already reached the same conclusion and simply did not like it. "The treaty letters," she said. "There will be a records room with a locked chest. Vorn is methodical. He keeps everything catalogued. Look for a green oilskin roll. 3 letters sealed in green and bearing the clan mark of the Ironhide, a bar between 2 tusks." "Green oilskin roll," he said. "I have it." She reached across the small table between them and put her hand over his. Not the brief contact from the Ford, this was deliberate and sustained, her large, warm hand covering his completely. "Be careful," she said, and her voice was very quiet. He looked down at her hand, and then up at her face, and the firelight from the single candle caught her eyes, and he thought about the laugh at the Narrows and the way she had applied clay to a stranger's horse without being asked, and the arrow that had missed him on purpose. "I will come back," he said. "I know," she said, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had decided something was true and would allow no other possibility. He went over the fence at 10 minutes past midnight. The garrison yard was dark and quiet, 2 guards on the main gate smoking and talking in low voices, a third doing a circuit of the inner yard. David moved along the fence line in the shadow between 2 storage buildings and watched the 3rd guard circuit for 2 full repetitions before he timed his crossing of the open yard to the records hall door. The door was locked with an iron bolt. He had a short pry bar in his boot, the kind of tool that found its way into a caravan guard's kit through sheer experience, and the bolt gave on the 3rd careful application of force with a sound no louder than a joint popping. He was inside. The records hall smelled of tallow and new paper, and the dusty official smell of a place where bureaucratic ambition had recently moved in. Vorn had clearly redecorated. There was a new desk, new shelves, and on the wall above the desk, a territorial map with red lines marking claimed boundaries that extended considerably further into the Orc clan territory than any legal agreement had ever authorized. David looked at it for a moment in the candlelight of the stub of candle he had lit from the hall lantern, and felt the cold, clarifying anger that Azra's careful summary had only partially prepared him for. He found the letters in the second locked chest, which he opened with the pry bar after 3 quiet, anxious minutes. Green oilskin roll, 3 letters sealed with green wax, the clan mark of the Ironhide, a bar between 2 tusks, exactly as she had described. He tucked them inside his jacket against his chest, relocked nothing, and went out the way he had come. The stockade was at the back of the yard, a rough pen of heavy timber with a single padlocked gate. There were 2 people inside, not 3, which meant one of the clankin had been moved or was already gone, and David tucked that worry away for later and focused on what was in front of him. The two were men, both broad and green and battered around the face in the way of people who had been hit recently and often, and when David crouched at the gate with his pry bar, they came to the front of the pen with the quiet alertness of experienced warriors who understood immediately what was happening and had the sense not to make noise about it. The padlock gave faster than the bolt had. He held the gate and gestured, and they came out in silence. He pointed to the fence. They understood, and they moved, and in 90 seconds all three of them were over the fence and into the tanner's yard, and Azra was there in the shadow of the workshop wall, absolutely still, her bow down and her eyes doing that rapid counting and cataloging sweep of the area. The reunion between Azra and the two clankin was brief and intensely felt. She gripped each of them by the forearm in what he understood to be the clan greeting, spoke 3 short sentences in the rolling Eastern clan dialect, and that was the whole of it. They moved. They were 6 streets away when the garrison alarm went up, a bell, then shouting, then the clatter of armored men in the yard. David measured the sound and the distance and made the calculation that they had maybe 4 minutes before search parties hit the outer streets. "The third person," Azra said as they moved. "Kerv, where is he?" "Not in the stockade," David said. "The pen only held 2, her jaw set. "Vorn moved him. He is the one who negotiated the original agreement. He has the most detailed knowledge of its terms. Vorn will be using him separately." She thought for a half-second. The inn. Vorn quartered his senior men at the Tanner's Rest on the South Road. If Kerv has been separated to be questioned, he will be held there, where the garrison soldiers are. "That is the opposite direction from the East Road," David said. "Yes," she said. He did not hesitate. "South Road." She looked at him, and this time the expression on her face was not the careful weighing of the first days. It was something else, something direct and warm and certain, and then she was moving, and he was moving beside her, and behind them the garrison bells were still ringing. The Tanner's Rest was a long, low building with stables attached, every window lit at this hour because the soldiers inside had heard the alarm and were getting out of bed and pulling on their boots. There were 2 men at the front door, both armed, both alert. Azra assessed this for 2 seconds and then handed her bow to one of the freed clankin with a single quiet instruction in the clan dialect. Then she walked up to the front door of the inn with David at her shoulder, and she knocked. The guard who opened it got approximately 1 second to register what was happening before Azra had his sword arm pinned behind him and his face against the doorframe, and was saying, very quietly, in the common language, "I am looking for a man of the Ironhide clan, being held in this inn. You are going to tell me which room, and you are going to do it right now, or I am going to do something to this arm that will take your garrison chirurgeon all winter to fix." The man told her. "Room 4, 2nd floor, guarded." The guard outside room 4 was a young local levy man who took one look at the woman coming up the stairs with Iron Com and her freed companions behind her, and he made the decision that David had predicted from the beginning. He stood aside. Kerv was an older orc, gray-haired and lean, with the look of a man who had spent 40 years negotiating difficult things in difficult rooms, and had emerged from all of them with his spine intact. He was locked in and he had a bruised eye, and he was, when Azra opened the door, sitting on the bed carving tiny stick figures with a belt knife with the complete composure of someone who had decided not to waste his captivity on anxiety. "Azra," he said with mild pleasure, as if she had arrived slightly late to a scheduled meeting. "Kerv," she said, "we are leaving." "I see that," he said, and picked up his stick figures and his knife and came. They went out the inn's back window into the alley, over a courtyard wall, through a vegetable garden whose owner would have unpleasant things to say in the morning, and out onto the market square's eastern edge, where the darkness was thickest and the road back into the Greywood began. They did not stop moving for 3 hours. When they finally stopped, it was in a wooded hollow 4 miles east of Keld's Crossing, in a place Azra had clearly been using as a waypoint before everything went wrong. There was a cache of supplies buried under a specific stone, dry tinder wrapped in oilskin, a picketed line for horses between two trees. She retrieved it all with the efficiency of someone returning to a known base, and within 20 minutes they had a fire, water boiling, and the freed clankin sitting close to the warmth with the particular exhausted relief of people whose ordeal was over. David sat with his back against a pine and let the tension of the last 6 hours drain out of him slowly, the way it always did after something had been survived, not all at once, but in degrees, like water finding its level. Azra sat beside him, not across the fire, not on the other side of the group. Beside him, her shoulder against his, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the chill of the night. She held out her hand. "The letters," she said. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the green oilskin roll and put it in her palm, and her fingers closed over it with the same care she had given her bow. She held it for a moment without moving, and he watched her face in the firelight, the relief she would not show to anyone else moving quiet and clear through her expression. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very low, meant only for him. "David, truly." "It was a good plan," he said. "It was a terrible plan," she said. "You went into a fortified garrison alone to steal documents and break 3 prisoners out of a stockade. That is not a plan. That is a prayer dressed up as a strategy." "It worked," he said. "It worked," she agreed, and she was so close that when she turned to look at him, her face was only a handspan from his, and her eyes were darker and warmer in the firelight than anything he had words for. He did not plan what happened next. He was not sure either of them planned it. He reached up and pushed a strand of damp hair back from her face, a gesture that was only partly practical, and her breath caught, and the next moment was entirely natural and entirely mutual. Her hand came up to his jaw, and he leaned in, and she met him, and the kiss was warm and unhurried and deeply certain, the way things are when they have been building for long enough that arriving at them feels less like a beginning and more like a recognition. When they pulled back, the fire was still going and the world was still present, and Kerv was conspicuously examining his stick figures with theatrical concentration from across the camp. "He does not miss anything," Azra said quietly, and there was the laugh again, low and genuine. "Neither do you," David said. She looked at him, and her hand was still resting against his jaw, and her thumb moved once, and she said very quietly, "No, I do not." The 2 freed clankin fell asleep in the small hours. Kerv, after depositing his stick figures in a neat row beside the fire, did the same. David and Azra kept watch together in the shifting warmth of the dying fire, not talking much, not needing to, and it was the most natural thing in the world to be sitting beside her in the dark forest with his shoulder against hers, and the sense that the world had arranged itself, for once, into a shape that made some kind of sense. At some point before dawn she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not a small gesture from a woman built as she was, and he felt her breathe slow and even, and he stayed completely still so she could sleep, watching the trees, which were for once the least interesting thing available. The next morning they had the problem of what to do about Aldrich Vorn. The letters were recovered, the captives were free, and the immediate crisis was resolved, but the underlying situation, Vorn in possession of the crossing garrison with the support of 3 merchant houses, had not changed. Without a legal challenge brought before an actual magistrate, he would simply resupply his soldiers, cut more bridges, and resume operations within the week. The nearest magistrate not in Vorn's pocket was in the town of Caldermere, which was a 2-day ride west, in the opposite direction from the Ironhide clan's territory. Kerv, who had spent 40 years negotiating difficult things, listened to this problem over breakfast and said, "There is a circuit judge, Magistrate Helm. He makes the Ashford to Keld's crossing run 3 times a year, and his spring circuit is due within the week. If we intercept him before he arrives at the crossing, he will have no jurisdiction problem. He serves the high road authority, not any local garrison." "Where does he overnight?" David asked. Millhaven Ford, Caravan said. There is an inn there for travelers. The bridge is out at Millhaven Ford, David said. Vorn cut it. Caravan smiled for the first time. Then the magistrate will be stopped there, waiting for the ford to be repaired or an alternative route. We can reach him on horseback via the Greywood track. David looked at Azra. She was already looking at him, her chin raised slightly, and there was something fiercely alive in her expression, the particular quality of a woman who could see the path forward and was already measuring the distance. We ride today, she said. They found Magistrate Helm exactly where Caravan predicted, sitting in the inn at Millhaven Ford, with the patiently resigned expression of a man accustomed to the frontier road's various ways of inconveniencing him, surrounded by 3 clerks and a bodyguard who was having an animated argument with the innkeeper about the quality of the stables. David Turner had spent 7 years learning how to make himself heard in situations that involved authority figures, and the key was always the same: be direct, be specific, and present the evidence before anyone has had a chance to form an opinion about you. He sat down across from Magistrate Helm, laid Azra's green oilskin roll on the table, and told the story from beginning to end without embellishment. Helm was a thin, dry-voiced man of about 50 who listened without interrupting and asked 4 precise follow-up questions at the end, the kind that cut directly to the legal substance. Caravan answered 2 of them in the official language of the High Road treaties, and Azra provided the 3rd answer by producing, from memory, the exact text of the water rights clause that Vorn had been trying to void, word for word, in both the common language and the clan dialect, which reduced Helm's senior clerk to furious note-taking. The 4th question Helm asked David directly. As a witness to the events of the last 4 days, are you prepared to provide a sworn statement before the circuit court? Yes, David said. Helm looked at him with the particular focus of a man assessing a stranger's reliability. You were employed as a caravan guard with no stake in the matter. Why did you involve yourself? David thought about the best way to answer this, and then decided the true answer was also the most legally sound one. Because someone was abusing their power to harm people who had no access to legal protection, he said. And I had access to both the situation and the capacity to do something about it. That seemed sufficient reason. Helm looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Azra. Azra met his gaze with the flat, level certainty of a woman who had decided the outcome of this situation and was simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. Helm nodded once. I will issue a warrant for Aldrich Vorn's arrest on charges of treaty violation, unlawful imprisonment of free persons, and destruction of high road infrastructure, he said. I will need an escort to the crossing. I know someone who can guide you through the Greywood, David said. 2 days later, they rode into Keld's crossing in a very different configuration than the 2 silent riders who had come in from the forest track. Magistrate Helm came in on the main road with his clerks and his bodyguard, and the kind of official authority that made garrison levy soldiers recalculate their loyalties very quickly. Caravan and the 2 freed clankin rode at the magistrate's left. David rode at his right. Azra rode ahead of all of them. She had her clan marks freshly touched up with the small kit she carried in her saddle pack, her bow across her back, her bearing absolutely erect, and she rode into Keld's crossing like someone returning to a place that had briefly forgotten who it was dealing with. People came out of shops and homes to watch, and the watching had the quality of a town taking stock of a situation and beginning to understand how it was going to resolve. Aldrich Vorn came to the garrison gate when the warrant was read, and his face went through several interesting colors before settling on the grayish tone of a man who had gambled on the certainty of his own power and found the table tilting against him. He had the political intelligence to surrender the documents and the garrison command without physical resistance, because he was not, in the end, the kind of man who fought battles he could not win, and there were 40 garrison soldiers looking at their new choices with expressions that suggested most of them would be taking the levy pay and going home very shortly. The treaty letters were authenticated by the magistrate's clerk, witnessed, copied in triplicate, and entered into the official high road record. Vaughan was removed from command and held for the circuit court. The 3 merchant houses who had been backing him sent immediate messages to Magistrate Helm expressing their complete misunderstanding of the situation and their deep commitment to the legal agreements governing frontier commerce, which made both Helm and Care smile in identical dry ways. By evening of that first day, Keld's Crossing had stopped feeling like Aldrich Vaughan's occupied territory and started feeling like itself again. The market square was noisy and busy, traders were moving, and the garrison soldiers who remained, the genuine frontier men who had joined for honest wages, had resumed their normal posts with the relieved calm of people who had narrowly avoided being drafted into something they did not want any part of. David found Azra at the garrison stables. He had been looking for her for 2 hours, moving through the celebration in the square where Kerv was holding court with Magistrate Helm and the freed clankin, were eating with the focused commitment of people who had been underfed in a stockade, and she had not been in any of it. He had checked the inn. He had checked the market. And then he had thought about where she would go if she wanted to be alone, and he had gone to the stables. She was at the fence of the stable yard in the long evening light, her arms resting on the top rail, looking at the horses in the pasture beyond. Among them was a big blood-bay mare, heavy-boned, broad-shouldered, with the particular musculature of a war horse, and the particular proud, restless quality of an animal that had been poorly handled for the last several days, and was making its opinion known with pinned ears and aggressive fence walking. He recognized the horse from the clankin's accounts. It was Azra's war horse, brought in with the garrison's confiscated animals and still impounded in the magistrate's temporary custody. Azra had not yet been reunited with her horse because the formal release of confiscated property required Helm's authorization, which was still being processed through the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated over the course of the day. She had found the horse on her own, though, and she was standing at the fence watching it with the particular expression of a person trying to keep very quiet feelings very quiet, which David had come to recognize as one of her primary expressions for things that mattered most. He went to the fence and stood beside her, and they watched the bay mare for a while in silence. "That is your horse," he said. "Myra," she said. "Yes." "She is magnificent," he said, and meant it. The mare was wild-eyed and furious and absolutely gorgeous in the way that things are when they are genuinely built for what they were made to do. "She is furious with me for getting captured," Azra said. "She has always had strong opinions about my professional judgment." "I will add her to the list of people with strong opinions about it," he said. The corner of Azra's mouth curved. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, and the evening was warm and golden, and the sounds of the town filtered through the stable yard in a lazy, contented way that felt like recovery. David thought about the road and the river and the 3 days in the graywood and the kiss in the firelight, and he thought about the fact that tomorrow or the next day, Azra would have her horse back and her letters were secured and her clankin were free, and the crisis was fully resolved. And she would ride east to the Ironhide camp, 2 days past the graywood. He thought about the roads he had ridden, about the years of moving from caravan to caravan, town to town, always enough work, always enough coin, always the same fundamental aloneness that he had made peace with so thoroughly that he had stopped noticing it until 4 days ago when it had suddenly become very loud by contrast. He could go back to Ash Ford. There was always another caravan that needed a point rider, and Gerald Vaughan would probably rehire him just for the sheer comfort of a familiar face. "David," she said. Her voice was quiet. He looked at her. She turned from the fence to face him, and she was direct, the way she always was, no approach, no preamble, nothing wasted. She looked at him with those dark, attending eyes, and she said, I want you to come east with me." He felt the words land, and the warmth that moved through his chest was something he had not expected to feel this clearly. "To the Ironhide camp," he said. "To the Ironhide territory," she said. "The banner rider route needs a secondary rider, someone who knows the frontier roads from the human side, who can operate in the border towns without drawing the kind of attention I draw in places like this. The clan will fund the position." She paused. "Kerv has already said he wants to propose it formally." It was a very practical case for a very practical offer, and she had delivered it with complete practicality, and he could hear under every word of it the other thing, the thing she was not saying in practical terms because it was not a practical thing, that she wanted him with her, that the last 3 days had rearranged something in her, that she was not willing to simply pack up and leave at a frontier market town, that she had spent 2 hours standing at this fence because the alternative was asking him to leave with her, and she was not entirely certain he would say yes. And that uncertainty was one of the very few things Azra Ironhide was not equipped to be calm about. "I am not clan-bound," he said. "No," she said. "You would be a contracted rider, your own horse, your own roads, your own choices." "Would I work with you?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Yes." "Then yes," he said. She let out a breath, and it was small and quiet and the most genuine thing he had seen from her yet, that tiny release of held tension, and before he could think anything else, she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him again. Not the tentative first kiss of the firelight, but something fuller and more deliberate. A kiss that was a declaration that said, "I want this. I want you. I have decided," in the way that only Azra Ironhide made decisions, completely and without ambiguity. He kissed her back with everything he had, which was considerable, because he had been falling toward this since the arrow missed him in the tree line, and she had looked at him over 3 dead men with absolute composure and told him the situation. When they came up for air, the bay mare had come to the fence and was staring at them with the fixed, suspicious intensity of an animal that had opinions about strangers getting this familiar with her person. "I think she is judging us," David said. "She absolutely is," Azra said, and touched the mare's nose with one hand and David's hand with the other, and the horse blew out a long breath that sounded remarkably like resigned acceptance. The official paperwork for the return of the confiscated animals came through the next morning, and David was in the stable yard when Azra went to collect Myra from the impound pen, and what he saw in the 10 minutes that followed was something he thought about for a long time afterward. The mare came out of the pen in a state of barely contained fury, head high, ears flat, dancing against the lead rope with the aggressive energy of a horse that had been poorly handled and was communicating her grievances at volume. The garrison hand who had been holding her looked relieved to pass the rope to someone else. Azra took the lead rope and the mare immediately spun and yanked, and Azra went with the movement instead of fighting. It turned the spin into a circle, walked beside the horse through the whole arc of it, and when the mare came around and found Azra still there and still calm and not going anywhere, the horse stopped. Azra put her hand flat on the mare's neck. She began to sing. It was very quiet, and the words were in the clan dialect, and David, who was leaning against the stable fence with no intention of going anywhere, could not follow the words. But the melody was low and even and warm, and the mare's ears came forward on the 3rd line, slowly, the way a person's shoulders come down when they have been tense for a long time, and suddenly find there is no longer any reason to be. Azra sang to her horse for maybe 2 minutes, one hand on the mare's neck, the other holding the lead rope loosely, and the big blood-bay warhorse went from the controlled chaos of a badly stressed animal to the deep, slow breathing of one that had been reminded of something essential, that this specific person was safe, that this specific person had always been safe, that whatever had happened in the last week was over. David watched this, and he did not move, and he did not make a sound, because what he was witnessing was entirely private even though it was happening in the open, and he had enough sense to understand that. but something had gone soft and warm and entirely certain in the middle of his chest, and he knew without being able to articulate it that this moment, Azra singing to her horse in the stable yard of a frontier market town, with the morning light coming gold and flat across the fence rails, was going to live in him for the rest of his life. He was aware, at some point, that Azra had stopped singing. He looked up from where he had been studying the fence rail with unconvincing focus and found her turned to face him across the stable yard, the lead rope in her hand, the mare's great head over her shoulder, and Azra Ironhide was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. She knew he had heard, not heard, witnessed, seen the thing she had not offered to anyone in a stable yard full of people, the small, true, unguarded act of loving something without any armor around it. He held her gaze. She did not look away. She did not say anything. She was very still, the way she was still before she made a decision, and then something in her face settled into the specific warmth that was uniquely hers, and she turned back to the mare and began checking the saddle fit with steady hands. David pushed off the fence and went to help, because that was something he could do, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the morning air was bright and clear and smelled of hay and horses and the frontier, and everything between them was understood without a word being spoken about it. Kerv made the formal proposal to David that afternoon, in the efficient, careful language of a man who had spent 40 years writing agreements that had to last. The position was genuine, a secondary banner rider role, contracted annually, paid in coin and supplied in horses and equipment, with freedom of movement along the entire Eastern Frontier Road network. The only obligation was to ride the routes Azra, or the war leader, assigned, and to maintain the relationship between the clan's border operations and the human frontier towns. David signed it with his left hand while Azra stood beside him, not touching him, not saying anything, just present in the way she was always present, completely, solidly, with the full weight of her attention. When he set the pen down, he heard her exhale very quietly. They stayed 2 more days in Keld's Crossing, long enough for Magistrate Helm to complete the formal documentation of Vorn's removal, for the water rights agreement to be re-entered into the official record with 3 independent certified copies, and for the Ironhide clankin to eat enough good food to recover some of the weight they had lost in the stockade. On the 3rd morning, they rode east. The Greywood was different going east, David found. Not the forest itself, the ancient pines and the deep loam and the silence were exactly the same, but his experience of it was different because he was no longer navigating crisis, no longer carrying the taut alertness of someone moving through country while expecting ambush. He was simply riding, in fine spring weather, through extraordinary country, with Azra Ironhide at his side. She rode Myra, who had fully recovered her composure and was covering the forest track with the long, fluid stride of a horse entirely in her element. She and Azra moved together the way things do when they are so long accustomed to each other that the rider and the animal think with the same intention, and watching them was something David could not help doing at regular intervals throughout the day. Azra caught him at it around mid-morning and said, "You have been staring." "I have been appreciating," he said. "Those are not the same thing." "Sometimes they are," he said. She gave him the look, the weighing one, but with the warmth fully present in it now, and then turned back to the track, and he could see the set of her shoulders carry something quietly pleased. They talked throughout the day, the long, easy conversation of people who have already proved themselves to each other, and are now in the more comfortable work of actually knowing each other. She told him about the Ironhide clan, the territory, the structure, the annual cycle of routes and markets and treaties, the way the war leader governed by consensus, and the way the banner riders were the nervous system of that consensus, carrying information and agreements across distances that would otherwise take weeks. He told her about 7 years on the frontier roads, the caravans and the merchants and the occasional very dangerous thing, the towns he had come to know and the ones he had come to avoid, the gradual accumulation of geographic knowledge that had made him, without any particular intention on his part, one of the more reliable point riders on the eastern routes. "You have been building toward this job without knowing it," she said. "Have I?" he said. "You know the roads," she said. "You know the towns. You know how to move through country without drawing attention. You know how to make a decision under pressure. The only thing you were missing was a direction to go." He looked at her. "Now you have one," she said, and there was nothing hidden in it, no protective armor of practicality or casualness. She meant him and the East and all of it together, and she said it the way she said everything, directly and completely, because she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. "Yes," he said, "I do." They camped that night at the eastern edge of the Greywood, where the old pines gave way to the mixed forest that ran up the base of the Aldmer Ridge, and the world opened up a little from the cathedral closeness of the deep wood into something with more sky. The three clankin made camp with practiced efficiency, and there was food and fire and the warmth of people who had been through something together and were past the worst of it. Later, after Cairv had gone to sleep and the clankin were taking their turns at watch, David and Azra sat together at the far edge of the firelight, their backs against a broad old oak with the ridge rising dark ahead of them, and the sky above the ridge so thick with stars it looked solid. "Tell me something," she said, and her voice was quiet enough to belong to the night. "What would you like to know?" he said. "Something you have never told anyone," she said. "Something true." He thought about it for a while, honestly, because she deserved honest. "I used to think the roads were enough," he said finally. "That moving was the same thing as living, that as long as I was going somewhere I was not standing still in a way that was bad. 7 years. He paused. "And then 3 days ago someone nearly shot me with an arrow, and I found out that what I had mistaken for contentment was just a very comfortable version of loneliness." The firelight moved over her face. "I have been a banner rider for 5 years," she said. "I have ridden alone across more country than most people see in a lifetime. I told myself the route was enough. The clan, the purpose, the necessity of the work." She turned her head to look at him, and her voice was very direct and very quiet. "I think I have been doing the same thing you have." He turned his head to look at her. She was very close, and the night was around them, and the fire was at a distance, and she was looking at him with the full, unguarded attention she had not given anyone in a stable yard full of people, the attention that was only for him. He said, "Azra," and she said, "Yes." And the second word was not an answer to his use of her name. It was an answer to something neither of them had asked out loud, and it was the only answer either of them needed. He kissed her with the full weight of the last week behind it, and she met him with the full weight of 5 years of riding alone, and choosing this and choosing him. And the night was warm around them, and the stars were overhead, and the fire was at their backs, and the oak was solid behind them. And when they finally came up for air, the world had the particular quality of things that have settled into their right arrangement after a long time of being slightly off. She put her forehead against his, and he felt her breath warm against his face, and she said very quietly, "I do not do things by halves." "I know," he said. "What I mean is," she said, "that when I choose something I choose it completely. I'm not going to, I do not know how to be measured about this." "Good," he said, and he meant it with his whole self. "I am extremely tired of measured." She laughed, and it was the laugh from the river bank, genuine and warm and transformative, and he thought he could spend a very long time working to hear that laugh, which was probably the most accurate measure of how far gone he was. The ridge crossing took the better part of the next morning. The Aldmer Ridge was not high, but it was steep and rocky, and the eastern face was threaded with spring runnels that crossed the path every 100 yards. They went single file in places, and David, who was behind Azra on the narrow sections, spent a considerable amount of time watching the way she handled Myra on the difficult ground, light-handed, confident, completely at ease with the places where the track crossed bare rock and the horses' shoes rang and sparked. At the top of the ridge, where the track leveled before the long descent east, Azra pulled Myra up and turned to look back west, and David came up beside her. The graywood was below them, dark and ancient and stretching westward to the horizon, and beyond it, invisible but present, the frontier towns and the roads and kelds crossing and all the recent terrible days. The east, the ridge dropped into a great open valley, gold and green with spring, and beyond the valley there were more ridges, and beyond them David knew was the Ironhide territory. "Welcome to the east," Azra said. He looked at the valley and felt something in his chest that was unmistakably anticipation, clean and forward-facing, entirely different from the neutral momentum he had been riding for 7 years. "It is beautiful," he said. "It is," she agreed, and she was looking at him when she said it. The Ironhide camp was at the valley's eastern end, sheltered by the second ridge in a broad hollow where 3 small streams came together. It was bigger than David had imagined, a permanent settlement of timber longhouses and smaller buildings, the Hides End timber of warband quarters mixed with the permanent stone of trade halls and clan records buildings. There were horses everywhere, in paddocks and picket lines and loose in a broad pasture, and there were people working, smiths and tanners and fletchers and builders. Ordinary camp life going on with the busy, ordered energy of a community that knew what it was doing. They came in down the main track, and people noticed. Not with hostility. David had been warned that humans did sometimes ride into the Ironhide camp on contracted business, and his presence with Azra and Kerv clearly read as sanctioned, but with the frank, assessing attention of a community that paid close attention to its own safety. Azra acknowledged the people who called to her with a raised hand and brief exchanges, and David rode at her shoulder and met the assessing looks with the steady openness of a man who was exactly where he meant to be. The war leader was a woman called Azra Ironhide, older than Azra by 10 years, built broader, with her clan marks on her jaw as well as her tusks, and the particular quality of attention that marked someone who had made a very large number of difficult decisions and had gotten most of them right. She met them in the central square of the camp with 4 senior clan members around her, and the expression of someone who had known Azra was alive and coming back, but had been waiting to hear the whole story before she let herself believe the situation was actually resolved. Kerv gave her the whole story in the efficient language of the treaty mind, laying out the events from the ambush to the magistrate's warrant to the recovered letters. Harda listened without interruption, her eyes moving between Kerv, the freed clankin, and David with the same systematic attention Azra used. When Kerv had finished, Harda looked at David directly. "You went into Vorn's garrison alone," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," he said. "Why?" He gave her the same answer he had given the magistrate, because it was the true one. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Azra, and something passed between them. The quick, compressed communication of 2 people who know each other very well and have a great deal of history, and do not need words for most of it. "The contract is acceptable," Harda said to David. Kerv drew it fairly. "You will have the east cabin at the camp's edge for a permanent billet when you are not en route." She paused, and the faintest shadow of something that might have been dry warmth crossed her face. "Welcome to the Ironhide territory, David Turner." "Thank you," he said. The first 2 weeks at the Ironhide camp were a process of gradual integration, and David threw himself into it with the same methodical attention he brought to learning any new road. He rode the local routes with Azra in the mornings and spent the afternoons in the camp's trading records hall, building a working map of the eastern road network from the clan's existing route documentation. He was not fluent in the clan dialect, but he picked up enough of it to manage basic exchanges and communicate his earnest intention to be useful, and the camp's suspicion, which was professional and cautious, not hostile, began to ease within a week. He also learned what it meant to be in Azra's company on her home ground, which was a different experience from the roads. She was Azra the banner rider on the routes, focused, contained, moving through the world with the efficiency of someone who had a job to do and was doing it. At the camp she was still herself, still direct and economical and fiercely competent, but there was more of her visible. She had a group of younger riders she mentored with the same precise, demanding attention she turned on everything, and watching her work with them was extraordinary. She was not gentle exactly, but she was completely fair, and she took their development seriously in a way that made them work harder for her than they would have for anyone else. She also, David discovered, had a very specific sense of humor that she deployed without warning. She made him laugh several times in the first 2 weeks at completely unexpected moments. A dry observation about a horse's stubborn personality, a perfectly timed understatement during a complicated route discussion, a single raised eyebrow at something Kerv said that conveyed an entire essay of opinion without a word. He had to admit, in deep and complete trouble. He had known this since the river, probably. Maybe since the arrow. The night of the 3rd week was warm and cloudless, and Azra had pulled him out of the camp after dinner to ride the ridge above the valley in the last of the evening light, because she said there was something she wanted him to see. What she wanted him to see was the valley from above, in the moment when the sun was down and the sky was still light, and the camp fires were beginning to show below in the hollow, the whole sweep of it gold and green and deeply alive, and the Ironhide camp at its center like a settlement that had grown out of the land itself. "I have ridden this ridge almost every week for 5 years," she said. "It is the best view of the territory." She paused. "I have never brought anyone up here." He looked at her. She was looking at the valley, and the last light was on her profile, and she was in that moment the most completely herself that he had ever seen her, not performing, not containing, not managing anything. Just here on the ridge she loved with him. "Azra," he said. She turned her head. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him, and her fingers came around his in the firm, certain grip that was entirely her. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I need you to know that. Whatever it looks like from the outside, the contract, the roots, all of it, I am here because of you, specifically you, and I am not going anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. The valley below was deepening into its night colors, and the first stars were opening up overhead. "I know," she said. "I know you are not." She turned her hand over in his, not releasing it. "But it is good to hear." He had thought about how orc courtship worked. He had not wanted to ask about it and get it wrong, so he had observed and listened and pieced together what he could from the conversations around him. What he understood was that among the Ironhide, declaring yourself to someone was called marking, not a physical mark, not a ceremony, but a declaration made in the presence of the person you were choosing and witnessed only by the sky and whatever gods were paying attention. It was private and permanent, and it did not require approval or ceremony or anyone else's involvement at all. It was simply the words said honestly. He did not know if he was doing it correctly. He was not orc, and he was not claiming to know the full weight of the tradition. But he had spent 3 weeks listening, and he understood enough to know that Azra had not done it with anyone before, and that she was the kind of person for whom the doing of it would matter enormously. "I mark you as mine," he said, which was the phrase as he had heard it, in the common language because his clan dialect was not ready for the full weight of this. "And I want you to know that I mean it in every way it can be meant, that I choose you, and that I am choosing to stay, and that this is not something I will unmake." She went very still. The last of the light was gold and low, and the stars were overhead, and the valley was deep below them, and Azra Ironhide turned fully toward him on her horse with an expression that he thought afterward was the most open he had ever seen on her face, stripped of everything pragmatic and professional and composed, and absolutely, completely present. "You researched the marking tradition," she said. Her voice was the very quietest he had heard it. "I listened," he said. "I may have gotten some of it wrong." "You did not get it wrong," she said. "You got it exactly right." She was still looking at him with that extraordinary openness. "David Turner, I mark you as mine. You came into my road at exactly the wrong moment and proceeded to be exactly the right thing, and I choose you. Completely. For as long as you will have this." He leaned toward her, and she was already leaning toward him, and Myra and his own horse stood companionably side by side in the way of horses who have been traveling together long enough to be comfortable, and he kissed her in the last of the light with the valley below them and the whole of the eastern sky overhead, vast and dark and scattered with fire. She kissed him back fiercely with all of herself, both hands coming to frame his face, then to grip his shoulders, then to draw him fully in, and he came willingly, the horses standing steady beneath them, and the world narrowed to this. Her and him, the night, the ridge, the clean smell of the high air and the distant sound of the camp below and the total, encompassing certainty of this choice and the woman who was making it. When they came up for breath, she put her forehead against his, and he felt her heart against his chest fast, which was the only way he knew she was not entirely composed, and he put his arms around her and held her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was considerable, and she pressed into it and let him, which was the most extraordinary thing she had given him yet. "I want to go back to camp," she said against his jaw. "Yes," he said. "Not to sleep," she said. "No," he agreed. She pulled back enough to look at him, and the look on her face was warm and dark and entirely certain, and she said, "Come on, then." They rode back down the ridge in the full dark, side by side where the path allowed it and single file where it did not, and the camp received them with the indifference of a community that was busy with its own life, and asked no questions of the people who lived in it, which was one of the many things David had come to appreciate about it. He was awake in the small hours, in the warmth and the dark, with Azra's breathing even beside him, and the sound of the camp settled around the log walls of the cabin, and the eastern sky beginning to lighten in the window over the door. He thought about 7 years on the roads, about the neutral momentum of it, the way it had looked from the inside like freedom and looked from the outside now like a long detour to arriving somewhere. He thought about an arrow that had missed him on purpose, about clay packed into a stranger's horse's hoof, about a laugh at the edge of a flooded river, about a woman singing in a stable yard, unguarded in the morning light, about "I mark you as mine," said in a voice so quiet it was nearly only for the stars. He pulled her a little closer, and she moved in her sleep and settled her head against his shoulder with the total, trusting heaviness of someone who knew where they were and was entirely at ease with it. And David Turner looked at the lightening sky through the window and felt, with a clarity that required no examination, that he had never been less alone in his life. In the morning she was awake before him, which he should have predicted, and he found her at the cabin door with 2 cups of camp tea, rough and strong, and almost nothing like what the frontier towns sold under that name, and the clear spring air coming in over the valley, and Myra in the nearby paddock pulling hay with the satisfied industry of a horse who had slept well. Azra handed him the cup and looked at him with the morning in her eyes, warm and direct, and she said, "I want to ride the southern route today. Will you come?" "Yes," he said. "We will be gone 3 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "The route crosses the high meadow above the Aldmer," she said. "There is a place where you can see both territories at once, the clan land east and the frontier roads west. I want to show you." He looked at her over the cup and she looked back at him, and they were both smiling in the specific way of people who have run out of armor and find they do not miss it at all. "Show me," he said. The southern route took them out of the valley and up through mixed forest into the high meadow that Azra had described, and she was right about the view. From the crest of the meadow, in the clear spring light, you could see both sides of the world at once. The long frontier roads running west through the borderlands, small with distance, and the great green sweep of the eastern clan territory rolling away to the horizon. 2 worlds in one sight line, divided by nothing but the ridge they were standing on. David stood beside Azra and looked at both of them, and he was aware that he was standing on the exact line between them which had always been the place he had occupied, had always been his territory, the border, the between, the road that connected things. It had felt like rootlessness before. It felt now like exactly the right place to be. "I was born over there," Azra said, nodding east. "I have ridden most of that country. But the west," she looked at the frontier roads, "I know it from the route. I do not know it the way you do." "I know it from the outside," he said. "You know the people who live here in a way I am still learning." He looked at her. Between the two of us. Between the two of us, she agreed. And the phrase carried everything, the roads and the territory and the work and the days ahead, and the fact that they were standing on this ridge together, which was not an accident or a detour, but the exact destination they had both been moving toward without knowing what it was called. She took his hand, and he held hers, and the view was extraordinary, and the sky above them was wide and bright, and the wind came clean off the eastern ridge carrying the smell of new grass and opened water, and the world went on, enormous and alive in every direction. He had spent 7 years moving through that world alone. He was done with that. He turned to Azra, and she was already turned to him, and he could see in her face the same clear, certain feeling he had, not the end of the road but the beginning of a different one, and better and shared. And he pulled her toward him, and she came, and on the high meadow above the two territories in the full bright spring day, they held each other in the open air with the whole world laid out around them, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Later, when they had ridden the full route and come back to camp with 3 days of shared country between them, and the easy, natural rhythm of two people who have found their pace together, Azra filed the route report with Harda's Records Hall, and David updated his section of the Eastern Road map. And Karev came by the cabin in the evening to drop off the next month's route assignments with the professional composure of a man who had noticed everything and was saying nothing about it. Which was its own kind of comment. There was a message from Magistrate Helm in the bundle, sent via the frontier post. Aldrich Vorn had been formally charged, the 3 supporting merchant houses had been fined, and the garrison at Keld's Crossing had been reassigned a new commander from the High Road Authority. The Circuit Court had entered the Water Rights Agreement as a permanent protected instrument. It was, in the careful language of official correspondence, fully resolved. Azra read it without expression and then handed it to Karev, who read it and set it down and said, "Good." That was the whole of the official response to 6 years of negotiation being vindicated and the crisis of the last several weeks being closed. David found he had expected nothing different from either of them. What came after was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all, which was the nature of things that had finally arrived at their right arrangement. There were routes to ride and roads to map and border relationships to maintain, and the endless complex daily work of the frontier, which was never simple and never finished. There were mornings when they rode out together and evenings when they came back, and the gradual, deepening accumulation of knowing each other that was better than anything David had imagined when he had imagined anything at all about his future. There was Myra, who had accepted him with the grudging pragmatism of a horse who had assessed the situation and found him adequate, and who occasionally consented to be curried by him when Azra was occupied, which Azra said was the highest form of equine endorsement. There was the high meadow, which became one of their routes, and the view from it, which was different every time they rode up, different light, different season, different weather, and which was always worth the ride. There were evenings at the campfire and nights in the eastern cabin, and the gradual integration of his presence into the fabric of the place, not as an outsider accommodated, but as someone who had found where he belonged and was doing the work of belonging fully to it. He was not a man who had been given much by the world. He had made what he had by riding through it carefully and showing up honestly and doing the job in front of him to the best of his ability, and that had been sufficient, and he had not asked for more than sufficient. He had not known that more than sufficient was possible for a man like him, a man of the roads with no great name or history, a man who had been plenty of things but never anyone's specific person, never someone's chosen. Azra Ironhide had decided differently. She had looked at him across the bodies of 3 soldiers she had put down, with an arrow still in the air, and she had decided he was worth the miss. She had sat across a fire in the graywood, and told him things about herself that she said to no one in a stable yard. She had marked him in the old way, on a ridge above the valley, with the stars as witnesses, and every day since had been the proof of it. She chose him again in the morning when she handed him a cup of rough camp tea, and in the afternoon when she pulled up beside him on a ridge and pointed at something worth seeing, and in the evening when she came into the cabin and found him at the map table and put her hand on his shoulder and stood there for a moment, just being there, just present, just sure. She was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and she had chosen him specifically out of all the available choices, and she went on choosing him with the same quiet, iron certainty she brought to every decision she made. He thought about this sometimes when they were on the high meadow, looking out over both territories in whatever light the sky had on offer, and he thought it simply, "I am the luckiest man on any road in the world." And then Azra would say something dry and precise about the state of the southern ford, or Myra would do something obnoxiously sovereign, or the wind would come over the ridge and bring the smell of the west, and they would ride on together into whatever the frontier roads had next. The day Azra brought him a second set of clan route bracers, plain iron, unstamped, the kind worn by contracted riders of the Ironhide network, she did not make a ceremony of it. She simply set them on the map table in front of him one morning while he was working and said, "Harda approved the permanent contract renewal. You are on the official route ledger now." He turned them over in his hands. They were practical objects, utilitarian, nothing special to look at. He put them on. She watched him buckle the clasps with an expression he had learned to read, the quiet, contained version of something she felt strongly, the version that only showed in the quality of her stillness and the slight additional attention of her eyes. "Azra," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and kissed her, which was not unexpected and also not in any way routine, because she kissed him back with the full, fierce warmth that she brought to everything she chose to do, and the morning came in through the cabin window in long gold bars, and outside the camp was waking up, and Myra was calling for her breakfast from the paddock with characteristic impatience. "Your horse is shouting," he said against her mouth. "She is always shouting," Azra said. "She has opinions about delays." "So do I," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him, and her eyes were warm and dark and absolutely certain, and she said, "We have a route to ride, David Turner." "We do," he agreed. "So ride with me," she said. He took her hand. They went.